Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. Are we still alive? Are we still here? Now, I'm sitting next to an individual that I keep seeing in every single continent. I think, where haven't we covered? Antarctica. There it is. That's the next one. Mark is the CEO of Gates Foundation. You oversee $200 billion. $200 billion in investment in funding global development. And of course, at the beginning of May, there was the huge announcement by Bill of the $200 billion over the next 20 years. A couple of weeks ago, we were in Ethiopia, in Addis, and we were at the African Union. And there, Mr. Gates said, of the $200 billion, 70 to 80% is going to African development. Again, another round of applause. Now, Mark, you are able to, saying such statements as you overseeing $200 billion when it comes to global development is a huge statement. But of course, philanthropy has always played a gap filler between where government and multilateral organizations aren't able to reach. What are some of the systems that you feel we need to now look at as a broker system, number one, but most importantly, how do we do things differently than how they've been done before?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Nomzamo. It's great to see you again. Thank you for being everywhere, from Ethiopia to Sevilla to New York or Seattle. But first, it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. This is an amazingly important event this week to talk about money and how you spend money and how you spend money effectively to make sure you're saving lives and building a dynamic future for those who most need it, primarily across the global south. And so the first part of the answer to your question is philanthropy is not, never has been, and never will be a gap filler. That's not our role. The primary capital engines that get you progress are the private sector gets you an energy of dynamism, and the public sector has to take primary responsibility for service delivery. Philanthropic capital, which is what we are, can play a very specific role. We can be a catalyst. We can be an energizer. We can take risks that the private sector is unwilling to take because it benefits poor people and there aren't enough markets in poor people, and that the public sector is too nervous to take because they'll get criticized about what they're doing with taxpayer resources. So our role is, can we prove different models of how you can work together, like the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, which President Sanchez and President von der Leyen, both along with my boss, Bill Gates, were launching a replenishment of this week. We can fund innovations. We can fund different ways to get dynamic new vaccines, digital public infrastructure, new agricultural developments, that those are going to be transformative for the people who need them. And so when you talk about the historic announcement we made in May, and it is truly a historic announcement, we were looking back, it's our 25th birthday as the Gates Foundation this year, we're 25 years old. We were looking back and saying, well, we've actually spent $100 billion in those 25 years. That's the largest amount any philanthropy has ever given. And what have we learned about where our impact is highest? And where can we make the greatest difference going forward? And what should we do? And the commitment we made, that Bill made, is that he will rule his remaining fortune and all the assets the foundation currently has, and we will spend them all in their entirety over the next 20 years, by 2045, which will amount to $200 billion, because we believe this is the moment where we need to invest and double down. We want to send an example and send a message to the public sector and the private sector, but that role, huge though that number sounds like, it's a tiny proportion of what's really going to be needed to drive the human development the world really needs.
I'm glad you end off on that note, Mark, because I want us to confront hard truths, right? Because we sometimes sit in conversations and we speak about the problems, we speak about solutions, but there's that little gap that we need to kind of confront. What are the hard truths that society needs to confront when it comes to global development, and what are some of the catalytic changes that we can be able to implement when it comes to reforms?
Yeah. So one of the hard truths which we're just facing is money is scarce and it's getting scarcer. That we're seeing cutbacks in traditional aid from the global north, and we're seeing massive fiscal constraints being faced across the global south, who are, over 60 countries are having to pay more in debt service than they are able to pay on health and education at the moment. They're big challenges. So when you have fiscal challenges, you have to prioritize. You have to think what and where are the most important ways to spend money. And this week in this event, when you're thinking about financing for development, we have a bias at the Gates Foundation. We go, but the most important investment anyone can ever make is in human capital, human beings. How do you make sure first that people who might be at risk of dying live? Whether it's a baby who needs a vaccination, an HIV positive person needs access to antiretrovirals, a child that needs a malaria bed net, a person with tuberculosis who needs a treatment, first live, and we can do that, the world can do it, and then provide productive opportunities, starting with education and nutrition, but then build up, because those are the dynamic building blocks that lead to long-term, sustainable, dynamic economies across the continent of Africa, across Asia, across Latin America. And that hard truth is, we speak a lot, and I used to work at the UN before I worked at the Gates Foundation, so I can say somewhat candidly, we're very proud of what we do, but there is often a little bit of a tendency to talk in generalizations, to talk in big picture. We need new forms of financing, we need new partnerships, we need new forms of, all of that is true. But the hard truth that I would like to do, we then need to go one layer down and be very specific. What does that look like in the health sector, in the education sector, in the environmental sector, in infrastructure? How do you combine the investments in human beings and human potential with the kind of infrastructure that's going to generate long-term economic growth? We need to make tough choices, and we need to keep prioritizing, but keeping our eye on the prize, that this is the most important investment the world can make in its own citizens and the opportunities and potential for its people, particularly the poorest and most vulnerable.
You know what I love about the Gates Foundation? Yes, please. The Gates Foundation does an incredible job at scaling up the solutions, but when it comes to actually finding out what the solution is, you scale down to the why. Rumor has it that you guys love to ask why, but why and how. Mark, let's dive a little deeper into multilateralism, something that you've navigated. In your answer, actually, you've just said that you worked with the UN and also with, now that you're in the philanthropic space. I think what's important for us is to understand what are some of the gateways that communities can be able to access this kind of funding whilst also facing these hard truths.
Well, first, if we pull back, what is the real power of multilateralism? To me, it has two elements. One is the normative power. It's by making global commitments. This organization, organizing the country, is about global citizen. Global citizens have global commitments. The whole point of the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals is they are commitments made by every country on the planet, including the United States at the time, to its own citizens and the world's citizens. About we need to invest and prioritize, we need to invest in people, we need to invest in a healthy planet. Those are priorities. And then the question is, how do you do that? And it turns out multilateral approaches, when done right and effectively, are the highest impact route to that. So we discovered that the hard way. We didn't start our foundation thinking we would end up being a significant funder of multilateral initiatives. I promise you, Bill and Melinda, when they set it up, thought, we'll do this dynamic, we'll introduce some thoughtful, dynamic ways coming from the private sector. And we found actually setting up a multilateral entity like the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, like the Global Fund to fight TB and malaria. Those are about pooling public capital, philanthropic capital in really smart ways. You've heard about them a little bit today already, that leverage the best of the private sector. It's the private sector that manufactures the bed nets, the vaccines, the antiretrovirals, but does it in smart, well-regulated ways that think about how you drive down the cost, improve the quality, and then last but definitely not least, in any ways the most important, you have to build concrete partnerships driven by the countries and communities on the ground where the work happens. If you're not giving autonomy and agency to those countries and communities, you are not going to build long-term sustainable success, full stop. And I think that has been a mistake that probably in the early days was made. There was a lot of talking about it and not a lot of doing. And now, this event right now, and given where we are in the world, there has to be a lot of doing. What does that look like in practice? What's the capacity? What are the partnerships? Break it down by sector again, and measure your outcomes by, does it actually reach the people who need them?
Does it actually reach the people who need them? A couple of weeks ago, there was a bunch of sightings around the world. Bill Gates took to the stage and announced an incredible gift of $1.6 billion that will go to protect a generation. It was a powerful example of what coordinated global action still remains possible, of what we can achieve in a divided world. But the moment also called for action. Who are we moving forward to this? I think what's important for us as we break away from this session, Mark, is how can we build systems where countries can be able to stand on their own and not only rely on donors?
Yeah. So there are lots of ways you can do it. I mean, first, it's got to start with the countries themselves. I mean, countries need to have important national debates about their own priorities and how and they're going to allocate their own domestic resources and maximize the domestic resources. That's a big part of the Seville plan of action that's being developed here. But they need support. The previous speaker, the vice president from Sierra Leone, was talking about the challenges that many African and other countries from the global south faced as a result of the global COVID crisis, where they were essentially frozen out of large parts of global assets. They weren't able to make the investments that high-income countries across Europe or in the United States were able to make. In those contexts, you need to acknowledge that they need to maximize and drive that work, but you've got to provide the strategic support. That can be philanthropic support. It can come from multilateral development banks like the World Bank. It can come from aid agencies. But all of that has to be centered around ultimately national and to some degree regional plans for investments. And I emphasize regional because a lot of the areas we work on, for example, global health, are regional public goods as well. You need to have disease surveillance systems that actually are tracking disease outbreaks across multiple countries, because we learned the hard way in the COVID crisis that if you don't do that, the world will not be prepared. You need to think about that, certainly when it comes to complex areas like climate change, and then when you're working in areas like we do on climate adaptation, which is particularly agricultural development, you can work on crops and livestock that need to be fit for purpose for agroecologies, but agroecologies don't stop at country borders. How you're working on, we work, for example, on particular forms of rice that are going to be much more productive in tropical West Africa, where tropical West Africa is still actually the world's largest rice importing region, but could and should over time become incredibly self-sufficient. And that dynamic is there. They've got the dynamic farmers on the ground. You've got our policies. Again, making it concrete. What does that look like in healthcare? What does that look like in agriculture? What does that look like in education? And that is the multi-billion-dollar question that we're facing this week and going forward, of how you provide concrete support for the countries in need, but allow them also access to what is the best global science and technology around what this looks like. What are going to be the best tools and interventions, whether they're in areas we work on like agriculture or health, or in many other areas of industrial development or other areas. And I think something like the AI revolution, actually, which is at one level massively overhyped as a phrase that we all use, at another level, it's actually on a really important inflection moment where we are seeing very tangible, low-cost access things that can help, whether it's a primary healthcare worker able to triage an at-risk pregnancy in a rural area, whether it's a teacher able to actually better provide foundational maths and reading, literacy, numeracy for students, whether it's AI for supporting a lot of those smallholder farmers. I recently saw an amazing demo in India of this smallholder farmer in rural Odisha who's got this app which has just been developed that's able to tell her what her soil type, what fertilizer use she needs, what crops are going to be best used on those crops, actually how to apply for government services on that, weather forecasts, also link it then of once you grow the crops, here's the best pricing you're going to get, here's the market you get, all in a single app and all adapted, this is what AI has done, into the local language. So that it's fully available. Those are the kind of things that we've got, and I know that's a very granular bottom down. How do you pull that top up and make sure that the financing systems are helping hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers like her across Asia and Africa get that tools and grow enough food for themselves to support themselves and their families and boost their income?
It's just absolutely brilliant. And I know we've got time up, but I've got one more question that is very much in the theme of renewable energy, which is why we're here as GC Now. You speak about the agri-economy and the agri-health. I want to find out, does the Gates Foundation focus as well on renewable energy when it comes to these solutions? I mean, we speak about AI, which may sound like jargon, but it's no longer jargon anymore because it's becoming even more accessible. But with renewable energy, is it something that the foundation sees as something that you can be able to lean on when it comes to finding the solutions that are needed?
Yeah, so we don't work directly on energy ourselves. Our focus in the climate space is very much on the climate adaptation, because that is where we see the greatest needs. Over 70% of the world's very poorest people are rural poor, who are smallholder farmers, who depend on that, who are the people being most affected by climate change already across South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. They are facing greater floods, droughts, uncertainty, and so that's where our focus is, because there's no private money or even sort of concessional loans that can fill that gap. But Bill Gates, IOS, does do an enormous amount of work himself. He has a thing where he's collected money from a range of high net worth individuals and philanthropists for something called the Breakthrough Energy Initiative, which is looking at transformative energy tools that can be, over time, hopefully be very low cost, at scale, and that will be able to drive that. But he's using some private capital to do that, because that's an example of where we believe over time many of them will fail, but there is going to be a long-term return to that for what's going to work best in the global south. So we understand there's a dependency, and that's important for us as the foundation. We know, and even with the amount of resources we have to focus on the areas where we're confident we're going to have the highest impact. We know that has dependencies. We depend on energy. We depend on infrastructure. There need to be the roads for those smallholder farmers to actually get their crops to market, or for at-risk patients to be able to go from a primary healthcare center to a tertiary health hospital or something like that. So this is all the ecosystem of financing has to think about the whole economy, and that's what has to be driven by the countries themselves setting their global priorities. And then within that, philanthropies like ours, other partners can come in and provide, both very direct interventions like that AI tool I talked about, or different kinds of, seeds or health interventions. But I really want to keep coming back to where I started, because it's just, I think people get lost when they look at numbers and they're looking at billions and they're talking about technology, and even we're often accused of focusing a little too much on technology, and we go, really, what this is all about is people. That if you come and visit the Gates Foundation, the vision that's carved on our wall, the mission that really drives everything we do, is the belief that every single person, wherever they're born, deserves the chance to a healthy and productive life. And that's what development finance has to be about, providing that opportunity to every man, woman, and child on the planet.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mark, thank you. I could keep you on the stage until the sun goes down. Thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you for the work that you're doing at the Gates Foundation, and of course your commitment to impactful change. Thank you. It's good to see you. I'll see you in Antarctica.
Antarctica it is. Thank you.
Mark Suzman, ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause, please.